Hello. Well, thank you everyone for coming to our event, Not Another Bloody Poet, which was occasioned by unprecedented poetic success in awards normally sort of cornered off for prose, our cousin, perhaps, in genres. I'm Declan Ryan. I work here in the English department, and I'd first like to introduce our panel members. To my extreme left is Andrew Macmillan, whose debut physical won a number of awards, including the Guardian First Book Award. First time a poet had won that award, which was, I think, where the quote came from. Not another bloody poet. It'd been a fine year for poetry. Obviously, we'll never see the like of it again. To my left is Ruth Bedell, who teaches in the English department here and has published a number of collections of poetry. She's got a new one on the way. She's judging this year's T.S. Eliot Prize, which we might talk about later on. Her last collection of poetry was up for the T.S. Eliot Award, and she's been nominated for basically everything you can imagine. To my right is Sarah Howe, whose debut collection, Loop of Jade, won this year's T.S. Eliot Prize. The first time a debut had won that award, and it's a fine thing indeed that happened. And then at the end of the panel on my right is Parisa Ebrahimi, who's Sarah's editor, and she edits the poetry list at Chatto, and of course Hogarth, the finest imprint in the country. It's not the case. There was a misprint earlier today. But Parissa's seen a number of books to full term, and her most recent collection, Sarah's, won the Eliot, but she's been nominated and won many awards as an editor, and she's built a very fine list indeed, which we'll talk about. So I think probably to kick things off, we'll get the poets to read for a few minutes each. So I think we're going to ask Andrew to start proceedings. So please welcome Andrew Macmillan.
Thank you very much. It's a real joy to be here. The reason I was just playing with my phone then is I was going to try and delight you all with some new stuff, but I can't find the file that I just emailed to my editor. So we'll have to make do with the old stuff. All the old favourites, as we can call them. So physical kind of took me by surprise in terms of how well it went down. I never expected anyone to really want to read these poems, let alone to accept them as they did. And the best thing to do, as we all know, when you've had a little bit of success, is to read bad reviews of your own work to keep your feet on the ground. There's a great one that I always like to remember by someone that we won't name, Alan Dent, who said of it, whilst this book may prove popular amongst the homosexual community, it won't be for the poems. It's always a great phrase that I like to remember. He also suggested that this poem might be immoral, and I hope it is. It's called Just Because I Do This Doesn't Mean. Not knowing names doesn't make it something less. The mid-road fight over red jumper and bike doesn't make it something more. It was just a long walk through seesaw streets, a stomach stretched tight as drum skin of a hollow abdomen, mouths finding every part of one another, watching the mirror like a laptop screen, a moon that kept trying to light us but kept off, a flat full of short flight stopover. The one who wanted to pretend he was wrestling, to be pinned under the anxious face of the clock, watching the kisses that wanted to stay for longer than a night. The one who said he wanted to write, the way an old woman in slippers might say she used to want to be a dancer. The heavy scent of them as they showered and I dressed, running till I was breathless in the centre of town. It wasn't the rain. The rain hadn't come yet, but it would. And I'll just read this one to finish off. The poem that my mum's taken to calling Andrew, please don't read that one again. Its more proper name is Urination. And I'll dedicate this to Dec, because we did just have to go for a wee at the same time before we began.
It's a very tender moment.
I'm scared of bumping someone while they piss. Those Mondays I'm a pack horse, bags hung, swinging around the urinal bodies, and one day I know I'll knock someone and they'll piss their legs or they'll turn slightly and show another man their full arc, or they'll fall into their own wet puddle, cock, limp, and neither of us will look, or he'll look at me, avoiding looking, feigning interest in the hard cream tiles. Maybe it's that I dream of being bumped, knocked from my aim by a stranger, the briefest touch during the private act. The toilet is an intimacy only shared with parents when you are young, and once again when they are older, and with lovers, when, say, on a Sunday morning stretching into the bathroom, you wake to the sound of stream into bowl and go to hug the naked body stood with its back to you and kiss the neck and taste the whole of the night on there and smell the morning's pale yellow loss and take the whole of him in your hand and feel the water moving through him and knowing that this is love, the prone flesh, what we expel from the body and what we let inside. Thank you.
Thanks to Andrew, obviously, because that was immoral, we now have to end the event. Shame for all of us. No, that was great, thank you. And we'll come back to questions about people like Denti later, I imagine. Ruth is now going to read from her new collection, Tidings. I think possibly the first time it's been read from, which is a lovely thing.
Well, I'm just beginning. Whenever you start a new book and it hasn't come out yet, and Parisa is my editor too, so this may be the first time Parisa's heard it in action. And she's entirely responsible for this book. So she wanted me to write a book about Christmas. And so I did, and you'll hear who the narrator is. It's also about homelessness and migration and foxes and disappointment. The voice of silence. I'm the oldest angel, the dark side of the brain. Everything untold, suppressed, unseemly, or wild is under my protection. I am the seed of fire in a hearth you thought was cold. The stillness when you step into moonlit snow, and who you are in private. I appear whenever surface cracks, luster and veneer rub thin. Silence, you say, when you make room for wonder. I am less and less here, but tonight, for 24 strange hours in the darkness of the year, I have a voice. For this is Christmas Eve, when everything hidden comes alive. Children's toys that have rolled under the sofa or stay in the cupboard unplayed with for years. The mice you weren't aware of in the wall, and your own unspoken longing to be given a little more by life. Suddenly, if you listen, all unnoticed things can talk. And so can I. Tonight, I play a part in everyone's secret search for something better. Come with me to St. Pancras Old Church on a little London hill, ruined with 20 centuries of human stories. Nearby, shops are closing in Camden High Street, Euston Road. The sky is that bruised colour you hardly think is sky. And sodium lights from the station terminal flicker in glass sides of the bus shelter like a zodiac on mica. London's neon glory falls on wet purple tarmac of Royal College Street and its last-minute traffic. On roadworks, traffic cones, surveillance cameras above the door of the homeless hostel, and the final Eurostar before the Christmas break. Below us Evening pads down Pancras Road and pokes its nose through shy, half-open doors of girls tying last-minute mistletoe. In Goldington Crescent, Unity Mews, Penryn, while young men, fresh from the gym, zip back the first ring pull of lager. People are trickling in through the gates, up the path, round the monuments, and into church. A stream of fur-trimmed anoraks and trailing scarves for the children's service. Those two figures, hurrying because they're late, are Sue and her daughter, Holly. Holly is 7. She's a pony, prancing on the firefly shimmer of LED light-bringer trainers. Through a 1,000-year-old arch, into an ancient shrine built over a Roman altar on the bank of the River Fleet. Long covered over, like the secret hopes hidden in every soul, which might flare out tonight in joy or disappointment, in a loneliness hardest to accept this time of year, or else might bear new fruit. That's why I'm here. I belong with secrets kindly kept, with possibilities, with mute. For what might a mysterious birth, witnessed by distant shepherds and foreign kings, the longings conjured up by giving, gift and given, and this time-stopping rift in every schedule? Yes, what can Christmas do to all of us?
Our next poet is Sarah Howell. Please welcome Sarah.
I, like Andrew, haven't yet got round to printing out these newer poems, so forgive me the iPad. I know it makes you look very, very silly. I thought I'd read this poem because I think it must be the poem of mine that's been seen by most eyes around the world, mostly thanks to Stephen Hawking, who read it on YouTube around this time last year for National Poetry Day. So it's a poem about light, and a poem about the absence of light, the utter absence of light, in the form of black holes, and it's called Relativity. When we wake up, brushed by panic in the dark, our pupils grope for the shape of things we know. Photons, loosed from slits like greyhounds at the track, reveal light's doubleness in their cast shadows that stripe a dimmed lab's wall, particles no more, and with a wave bid all certainties goodbye. For what's sure in a universe that dopplers away like a siren's midnight cry? They say a flash seen from on and off a hurtling train will explain why time dilates like a perfect afternoon, predicts black holes where parallel lines will meet, whose stark horizon, even starlight, bent in its tracks, can't resist. If we can think this far, might not our eyes adjust to the dark? It feels strange to read that poem in my own voice, actually. When I met him to talk about the commission, Stephen Hawking, who has, I think, quite a wry sense of humour, said, I don't have a very good voice for reading poems. It was originally designed to be a telephone directory. I'll read one more. This one is called On a Line by Xu Lizhi, and is a sort of tribute to that Chinese poet who some of you might know because his work went viral on the English language internet as well, late in 2014. He was a worker in a Foxconn factory in Guangdong, which happens to be my mum's province. But tragically, he was one of the many workers in such factories who just couldn't really take it anymore. They'd had such a spate of suicides at Foxconn in recent years that they'd actually strung up nets beneath the dormitories. So when she took this decision, he had to find a tall building in town to go to. You know what they make in Foxconn factories, don't you? They make iPhones and iPads and all these things we can't live without. His poems are really beautiful, actually. I encourage you to Google them. On a line by Xu Lizhi. I swallowed a moon made of iron, you sang. The one who would stare from a 4th-story sill, waiting for the brunt lick of dormitory fan to come round again. Pitched in the grimy glass, your still young face electroplates with lunar currents. It clogs the sky. Overtime, dense as a dentist's drill, you are shower-capped again in the assembly line, your eyes acid-etched circuitries where fatigue's fluorescent scrim settles like dawn. You float between the rows, ministering to never-ending components, their hands a flight of chrome. Tongue soldered by thirst, you sway, could almost reach the cartoon bulb twitching hot above your head. Later, in your bunk, among strangers hauled from sundry provinces who fart like dogs in their sleep, you write down a line about the screw that fell with an unheard plink to the factory floor. Words I read on a screen that reels at my touch and choke. Then tap the next link.
Well, it was great to hear from all our poets doing what they do most naturally, but we're going to force them into arenas of unpleasantness soon. I think Parisa probably hasn't prepared a skill for us this evening, so I think we're going to kick off our conversation now. And I think the first thing to get us all going would be to talk in fairly general terms to start with, I think, about sort of the state of poetry now as it is, as a kind of, if we can talk about it as a business or an industry. I think we'll come to what the public might think about it sooner or later, but I think Parisa's ideally placed because she's been building a list for about 10 years now. And I expect that she's seen quite a number of changes in the way that poets occupy kind of a place in the world, and, you know, with the advent of creative writing departments and with many other changes. So I thought the first thing I wanted to ask Parisa about is how she sees poetry at the minute and how she's seen it change in the years that she's been working as an editor, as a kind of an industry or a business to operate in.
Well, it's a sort of vibrant time, and I think everybody, I feel that it's become broader and it's become more diverse. And what I particularly like about being on this panel is that I'm here with people who I consider to be my generation, and I consider them to be my friends. And what interests me above all is that I feel that we have poets talking in their real voices. And I think that sort of diversification is something that has marked a big change in the last 10 years. So I think when I first started as a poetry editor, I felt somewhat inhibited by the lack of what Morrissey would say, people who said something to me about my lives. And I hopefully, in my efforts to sort of build a list, and I didn't sort of go into it with any sort of agenda or any sort of strategy. I was just passionate about certain poets and wanted to be enthusiastic about their work, and what an editor does is just make that enthusiasm communicable. And then the poets that sort of form the Chatto list, people like Sarah Howe, Liz Berry, Helen Mort and Adam O'Riordan, seem to me to quite simply and quite frankly speak in their real voices. And they have kind of common links between them all. And they sort of enshrine a sense of place, and they sort of enshrine the specifics, whether it's from a region or whether it's from a journey, in sort of Sarah's case. And I think that that sort of point of difference is something that marked out. I remember when I was I used to go to the festival readings at the Royal Festival Hall at T.S. Eliot Prize, and I would sit in the back row, and there'd be a sea of grey heads all sort of populating these readings. And I think if you go to the Ford Prize, if you go to the Eliot Prize, it's a totally different scene, and people will be standing there and whooping and standing ovations, and there's a great deal of energy around. And I really think it's because there's somewhere silently, magically, there's been a generational shift, and I think the key players are many people who are sitting on this panel.
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yes, you may.
Because I think some people here might not know what a list actually means. I mean, Chatto, which is Parisa's house, and Andrew is published by Cape. They live in the same building, but there are different publishers in the same building, in the same conglomerate. And I was, for instance, on the Chatto list of poems already published when Parisa came. I'd published books with other editors before she came. And so what does a young publisher do? She was here. Didn't you say this was a room used to fall asleep in?
Yeah.
She came to lectures. She was a King's alumna in doing English. And then she went to Chatto Windus, and she takes on the poets who, like me, are already there. And then she starts to, what they call, build her list. And so she waited quite a long time. I remember watching you, and you were very careful, and you followed poets in magazines or in readings, and then you really liked their work. And in fact, I introduced Sarah to you, didn't I? And she went entirely on the language, I think, on the voice.
And you would respond to certain things, as one always does. So much of our jobs are subjective. One person responds more to one thing than the other. And then it's just for me that the sort of rule of thumb was that you were sort of passionately in favor of something, and then you sort of, and that was the beginning of how it was. So yeah, it's a good definition of building a list.
And what's happening at the moment is that there are it's about 4 major publishers who have very, very keen poetry editors who, like Parisa, are building their list. In Picador, for instance. And also then there are other younger publishers, smaller publishers, just poetry presses, who, for instance, Liverpool University has started its own press, poetry press. They do little books, and they're really good. They've just started it this year. And so it's a very exciting time. They're putting forward new voices.
No, absolutely. I think that's completely the case. I mean, I just wanted to pick up on something that Parisa mentioned about this kind of generational shift. And one of the many reasons why I think everyone was so thrilled that Sarah's book won the T.S. Eliot Prize this year, among its many qualities, was also that it felt like a kind of a changing of the guard to some extent. I think obviously for people involved with the book, for Sarah, for Parisa, it was obviously a book that they'd worked on, but I think from a wider, slightly more distant point of view, it felt like kind of, I don't know, a slight change, a changing of momentum perhaps, and that this new generation of people who'd come of age in the last 5 or 10 years, they weren't just hanging around and, doing apprentice work anymore, that something important had happened, I think. And I just wanted to ask Sarah, not about her own book, because of course I couldn't make her do that, but if there were things that she'd seen in the last few years since she's been, going from someone who was learning how to write poems to someone who's publishing and obviously putting out now a collection which has done so well, if she'd seen a shift in the landscape, some of the things Parisa touched on, but also just her own experience of that.
Oh gosh, such a big question. It's very kind of you, Dec, not to mention that not everybody was happy about me winning the Elliot Prize.
We'll come to those.
Very gracefully stepped over.
Everyone who we care about.
Shifts that I've seen. Well, I guess I felt like a really awful moment in the poetry scene was when Salt closed its list a few years ago. That felt like a sort of big and quite scary shift.
Can we explain what SALT is for people who might not know?
So Salt was one of the independent presses that Ruth mentioned. It began as a predominantly poetry publishing house, and then I think for various reasons that others probably understand better than I do even, found that it was increasingly financially difficult to keep on with poetry, and so now they still exist, but they publish almost entirely fiction and maybe the odd poetry anthology here and there. And I thought that was a very sad time, because I admired many of the poets on that list, and I guess in the years since, it's been heartening that not only have they migrated elsewhere to existing publishers, but new publishers have come about, such as Liverpool University Press, but also Eyewear. It feels like quite a thriving scene in terms of the very small players who might even be just an individual who are doing it for the passion. And so I went to the Poetry Book Fair in Holborn a couple of weeks ago, which some of you might have been at, and walking around that hall, it was a room where all sorts of publishers had and magazines had their little stall, and it just felt like the most thriving, bustling thing. And I guess there have always been small presses, but I just had this sense in that room, oh yes, we are a community, and if things like this exist, maybe we can thrive despite all the financial, economic, disastrous pressures. Actually, I think that was a big factor in SALT closing down. It was around the financial crisis, wasn't it? So,
I mean, it's interesting with SALT because I'm thinking of that, they published, it was years ago, like SALT Book of Younger Poets, that kind of we were both in, and kind of so many poets have, and I was looking back through it the other day for something else, and it's amazing to see how many of them have gone on to kind of have first collections and be published. And so it felt, and I remember at the time when they decided to do this SALT Book of Younger Poets, and it was poets under 25 or something, wasn't it? And it kind of outraged that certain part of the poetry community that always likes to be outraged about everything, and thought that we were kind of all too young and things like that.
I was the oldest poet I was the elderly member of the SALT Book.
And it kind of felt, but it felt like then, since then, we've grown up entirely as a generation, like, and kind of known each other, and that's how I know most of the people that I know in poetry now of our generation, just from meeting each other at readings and things. And I felt like we've all kind of come up together. And that's always felt really nice. It means that you kind of, I never feel in competition with anyone. I feel like it's exciting when someone wins something or someone breaks through or something good happens to someone, because we all kind of started off from that same place. And it was Roddy Lumsden that put that anthology, Roddy Lumsden, Eloise Stormborough, wasn't it, who put that anthology together.
When you won Sunday Times Poet Book of the Year...
That was Sarah.
Oh, that was Sarah.
That was Sarah again.
What did you...
I won the Guardian one.
You won the Guardian, oh, sorry, yeah. But it was, I mean, you say it was a changing of the guard, but actually old guards don't like guards being changed. And, you know, the media especially don't. And perhaps we might talk a little about the media, because there are three lots of people here. There are the poets, and with them their publishers, and there are the audience, and you meet them at poetry festivals, which are burgeoning all over the place. But in between them is this medium called the media. And the media have their own ideas about what people ought to like. And that's why this guy said, oh, not another bloody poet.
I didn't know they'd said that about me. I didn't realise that was what we'd named the event after.
Well,
It's a badge of honour, I'd say.
Yeah.
But
I don't know, there's a sort of kind of related to what Andrew was saying, is there's a kind of collegiate sensibility at the moment, which is that you do genuinely get this impression that, well, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but that there are certain groups of poets, young poets, that have come up together through places like Salt, and also this wonderful pamphlet series called The Tall Lighthouse, which doesn't exist anymore. But I mean, I think it's no coincidence that every single new Chatto poet that I acquired started their sort of poetic lives through Tall Lighthouse and came up through Tall Lighthouse. But one gets the sense that, you know, for better or for worse, there are sort of groups of new poets, and everyone has their own sort of like identity and brand and flavor, and whether you like that or not is kind of up to you. But there's a sense that rather than the lone wolves of the old guard, there's this sort of musketeer mentality of you know, sticking together and maybe doing an anthology, or maybe putting together a poetry night, or maybe just going to the pub and sharing poems. But that for me, there's been that sense of actually these groups of supportive poets, and then I think that's changed a lot of things as well. Wouldn't you say, Declan?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I was going to sort of touch on this in a moment, but I think we'll sort of circle around to it now. I mean, there seems to be perhaps much more so, and again, obviously, you know, you only know what you know, but I mean, it's always seemed since the time when I've been involved in these things that there is that kind of collective thing. I mean, whether it's through, and there's obviously a rise of, you know, MAs and creative writing departments, and, you know, they have their own groupings, but also, as you mentioned, anthology series, or, you know, just sort of social groups of people. And it does seem to be the case that there are lots of people sort of pressing forward en masse, which is, you know, interesting and quite nice. And I think it immediately builds in this sense of not only community, but I think a kind of inbuilt sense of, you know, critical dialogue. And I think that's very important for someone starting out. I think, you know, there's a workshop culture now, perhaps, that might not have been, you know, always been the case. I know that when Ruth was sort of starting to write, that you had your own workshop group, and perhaps you could talk about that in a moment as well. But I think, you know, there does seem to be that thing that people are quite defensive of each other in a not inhibiting way, but in a quite nice way. And so when we maybe get to the point where, you know, people are attacked from the outside, it does seem that people slightly form square, which is nice to see. And, you know, if the media say something stupid or obvious or, you know, idiotic in you know, whatever capacity, you know, that it's nice to see people riding to each other's defence in a way that maybe wouldn't have been the case if there wasn't that kind of grouping of people. You know, it isn't the case, I think. I mean, I can't remember who said it. Was it Qureshi who said, you know, every time a friend succeeds, I lose a year of my life? But I mean, that seems to be less the case now.
But I think the point to make
He's
about...
a novelist.
Yeah, and he's a raging solipsist. Actually, he's a King's graduate. The point about publishers, certain publishing houses folding and no longer existing, and these wonderful pamphlet houses folding and no longer existing, is that that's also replicated in the media. So actually our books pages, those newspapers that you read that maybe 5 years ago you would have had a 16-page pullout, now you have an 8-page pullout. And the number of books that publishers publish has gone up exponentially in the last 5 years either. So what does that mean? Is that means that there's less space to publicize more books. And then that sort of puts a premium on reviews in a way that if you get a review that is, you know, cagey or whatever, you're not as effusive as one would like, it sort of means all the much more, I think. So the media is a double-edged thing. When it's great, it's great. And
But I mean, I think because social media and the internet has been fantastic in a lot of ways in terms of maintaining this community. But a lot of the stuff that I've come across, and, you know, nobody has to like my book. It kind of, you know, they're free to not like it. But the stuff that I found that really bothers me has been the things that people have gone out of their way to show me. And that feels quite odd. Kind of the review that kind of most upset me about, well, not the worst review of the book that kind of pointed out technical things, the one that kind of most upset me, someone linked to from another review. And I would never have seen it, and I could have kind of lived my life happily never knowing that Gregory Woods thought I'd cast off the limp wrist of aestheticism. But whatever that means. But someone kind of pointed it out to me and it was there, and I think that's shifted as well, somehow.
Well, it's the web, I mean, the internet has changed everything.
Yeah.
Shall I talk a bit about my
Yeah,
column?
no,
Because I
please do,
didn't.
yeah.
Because before the internet, I mean, between 1998 and about 2002, I wrote a column every week in the Independent on Sunday, which was analysing a contemporary poem. And it was quite interesting, and I did it for a long time. The top editors didn't want it at all. The book's editor was really sticking her neck out. And they said, talking about a poem, nobody wants that. And so we just did 200 words. And they got thousands of letters in saying, do more of that, do more of that. And so we extended it a bit, and we went beyond the pilot. And so it was a sort of, I asked for proofs, and there was no email. And I wanted to see how they'd done it, what they'd done to the poem, because poems depend on very tiny, minute editing things, as Parisa knows all too well. Poets complain when there's a comma. The arguments that Parisa and I have had about commas, my goodness. So I wanted to see proofs. And there are people in newspapers called sub-editors. And they are actually the people who are checking and all sorts of things, and they lay it out, put it into the paper. And the sub-editors hated sending me proofs. They didn't think that anybody a writer ought to be in charge of how they come out and look. But anyway, it carried on because the readers wanted it so much. So, in 2002, I published this book, which has collected some of them from it. And I very carefully did man and woman, man and woman. Nobody noticed, but a lot of the people wrote in to say, what a nice idea it is to have so many women. So, equal dues means so many women. Anyway, so I did that also in this book. And in the book, I explained to perhaps an American reader that British and Irish poets did not live, it had nothing to do with universities. They were editors, or they were journalists, or they were teachers, or social workers. About 4 years later, in 2006, I published this book, which was expanding. It was other poets that I'd done. And in this book, all I had to say about each poet was which university they taught creative writing in. So in 4 years, universities expanded into creative writing. It's a completely extraordinary story that these books happen to enshrine. So it's quite interesting that, here's your generation. You've done a creative writing degree. You two haven't, but you both teach in universities.
Yeah, I did a minor in creative writing, but mainly literature.
Right. Was that in Manchester?
In Lancaster and then at UCL. A rival of here, I shouldn't say it, should I?
No, sorry.
In creative writing, because it's interesting, isn't it? Because creative writing in universities, I think, sometimes gets unnecessary stick as well. People kind of think that it's somehow not cheating, but somehow that people, or also that those of us that have kind of gone into teaching have somehow escaped from the life of kind of drudgery and kind of something that poets are meant to kind of endure in the garret. But to me, it's been a democratic thing, and I think the breadth of our generation is testament to the different educations that we've all had. And it seems to me that, we were talking about Hogarth and kind of Virginia Woolf kind of in her house and the Bloomsbury set and kind of meeting and sharing work and things like that, that it used to be the privy, or it used to be the kind of experience of very wealthy people who could afford to do it. And actually now you can go into an MA seminar and you can have that same experience of just sharing work, of being in a room with other people that want to write. And to me, it's been an incredibly democratic experience. And in terms of being able to teach it, it's made me a better writer. Because you sat there and you're going, no, not that comma, move that comma. I mean, I don't use any commas at all, so it's fine with me, but or move something about, and then you have to go back to your own work and think, right, I have to interrogate this as much as I'm interrogating the students' work. And, I think it's been an incredible force for good. It's now being pulled by economic forces beyond the own subject's control, but all university subjects and all universities are at the minute. It's been pulled into that culture which is out of our control. And all you can really do in any university is try and be an anchor within it, and I think kind of try and subvert it slightly from the inside and use the money that you might have in a department for good to bring poets in to do interesting stuff and kind of try and work it from the inside. Maybe. It's not been filmed, this is fine.
It's all right, it's gone, isn't it? Actually, your dad, would you mind talking about your dad?
No, you've mentioned him now.
Because your dad has done a lot for poetry as well, hasn't he? I mean, the verb is sort of...
Yeah, so my dad's Ian Macmillan, the poet and broadcaster, and he was a labourer on a building site and got 500 quid from what was then called Yorkshire Arts, and became freelance, and kind of really built up that model of kind of community engagement in poetry, which is what I did a lot of work in when I first kind of graduated as well. So kind of going into community centres, going into prisons, going into kind of anywhere that would have them, and doing poetry workshops, getting them writing. And our generation and the generation prior to us have benefited from that as well, this kind of narrative. I always end up telling my students now that anyone could be a poet, and I don't mean kind of anyone could be kind of successfully published, but anyone has the potential to do it, and everyone's voice, everywhere you're from, is as worthy of poetry as somewhere else. And that seems to me to be something that our generation is getting much more than maybe previous ones did. People like Liz Berry and people like, kind of, like you were saying, speaking in their own voice.
Yeah,
that might not have been acceptable.
Yeah, that's a line from a Muriel Rukeyser poem, actually. I want to speak in my voice, I want to speak in my real voice. And I think, and it's something that, was probably told to me in a lecture in here, and it's always remained with me. And it's funny because it's my sort of guiding principle for picking poets. And when I look at there's sort of a kind of CV of sorts that you would expect from a young poet that's ready to be published, ready for their first collection, and some of them go to creative writing schools. Yes, that's a fact. It's never a decisive factor, but it's a fact. And many of them have pamphlets already, and they have some sort of sense of momentum behind them. But what's most interesting for me, I suppose, is that a lot of these poets come from non-traditional backgrounds, exactly what Andrew was saying, and so a poet like Liz Berry, who Andrew mentioned, she's from the black country, and she has a very distinctive accent, and she uses black country dialect in her poems, and it is something that most of us have probably never heard or come across, especially not in a poem. But yet this woman, this beautiful poet, opens her mouth and this magical voice comes out, and these words which one instantly understands within their context, and it's immediately transports you into a different realm of experience, which is what I think poems should do ultimately. And it's for me what's most interesting as a sort of, I kind of consider myself non-traditional editor in that I'm a poetry editor, but I'm not white and I'm not male and I'm not Scottish. So that immediately makes me a little bit different. And I think maybe there's no coincidence maybe that some of the poets that are on my list, the poets which represent the Chatto list, which goes back 150 years, so it has this kind of a rich history, but what it represents now is perhaps maybe a reflection of those editorial choices, and maybe is a reflection of that sort of impetus, and it's an impetus for change, I have to say. Although very interestingly, I don't know if anyone saw it on the television a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to embarrass Andrew. There was a television show about a train journey made across the length and breadth of Britain, and they chose 5 poets to go on this journey. One of them was Liz, this black country poet, and one of them was Andrew, and there are a couple of others, but I don't mention them. But my point being that it was a really exciting moment for me. Even though I've been doing this job for 6 or 7 years, it was a thrilling moment to see my poets, to see poetry on the television, and that was something that I just thought, there's been a series of sort of like gateway, there's been a series of sort of shifts, as I kind of mentioned before, and for me, something happened 2 weeks ago, and there was a shift, and I thought, this is the first time I've seen contemporary poetry on television that's not an BBC archive from 1967 and there's Larkin or Betjeman or something, and that's very, it just bodes so well. I think there's so much more to come, and I think it feels like change is on its way.
Yeah.
I think me and Liz could front the new Bake Off replacement for the BBC, couldn't we?
Good. It's a good idea.
But just to pick up on that, I mean, it was sort of exactly leading into what I was going to ask about. I mean, we mentioned earlier that Andrew and Sarah last year both won prizes which are open to novels, and it was a kind of a moment where it occasioned this phrase, not another bloody poet, because, there was a bit of a backlash in certain quarters because of the fact that poetry was intruding in this area, which maybe had been cornered off for kind of more marketable genres. But I think leading on from that, I think the thing that perhaps was most exciting is exactly what Parisa's just mentioned, this sense that none of this stuff particularly matters. An award is a lovely thing for the poet, but it only matters, I think, in a more kind of broad sense if it means that there's an appetite for this, which is, wider, and people are ready to approach a book of poems in the same way that they might have done a new novel that was, getting a lot of press. And, I think surely, the most rewarding thing about this is the sense that perhaps it means people who wouldn't have bought a book of poems will buy a book of poems. And, it's a good book of poems. And then they read it and they think, okay, this is something that says something to me about my life, again, to quote Parisa earlier. And so I think just to open it up to Andrew and Sarah particularly, but, to everyone, of course, winning things which aren't only for poetry, I mean, not just to talk about the award, but also to talk about perhaps your sense, if you have one, if it isn't something too awful to think about, a sort of a sense of a readership, or who you're not writing for, but people in the world living with the work that you produce, and if that changed at the point where you thought, okay, this isn't now just a poetry crowd, perhaps.
Oh,
Sorry.
I feel like I'm almost out of place on this panel, and I feel like it was almost quite anomalous that I won that prize that you refer to, Declan, the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year prize. Because I feel that unlike Andrew or unlike Liz, I don't naturally have this capacity to connect with people. I don't think that I'm the first sort of poet you would think of if you think of poems that many, many people would want to read. And so I sort of feel guilty about it almost, that I do wonder if sometimes people pick up my book thinking it's going to be one thing and then are terribly disappointed when they discover that it's not actually that thing. But anyway, yeah, audience, and I guess what I'm getting at there is that I feel like there are many different strands in my work, and hats off to Parisa that she, took on my book, which I think must have been quite a risky proposition in many ways, in that it does have these slightly more, I probably wouldn't call them difficult myself, but more resistant elements that you need to live with for a long time. And I'm aware that that's asking a lot of people in our busy lives to, write poems that might need reading 2, 3, 4 times. But I suppose I'm honoured when people do put that sort of work in. I felt like some of my clashes with the media in the wake of the Eliot Prize did have to do with this question of audience and also accessibility. I think one of the most upsetting to me encounters that I had was with one journalist who I knew that the interview was going badly, even as I was in the interview. He'd phoned up the morning we were due to meet and said, can we delay this by 3 hours because I'm still going through your book and I can't make sense of it. And he showed up 3 hours after that, and he said to me, I have a first in English from Christchurch, Oxford, and I found your book completely incomprehensible, so what chance does anyone else have? And, I mean, I am not alien to that world. That is the elite world of university education that I went through. My parents didn't go to university, they didn't know it, but that's my world. But I found it shocking to hear that from him, because it felt to me like a sort of misplaced snobbery, I'm a genius, but all those masses out there, what chance do they have? And I guess that particularly rankled with me from my background, because my mum, she didn't go to university, she barely had any education at all, but she's an autodidact in the most amazing sense. And I sort of feel like to patronize people in that way and say, oh, well, they couldn't possibly deal with polysyllabic words, you know, is actually that's a really awful vein in arts journalism. And I would like to do away with it entirely if I could. But also, I felt like it was bound up with race in interesting ways, as well as class.
It's also bound up with gender.
And gender, of course, with gender. It was, I think it was maybe number one, it was gender in this particular case. But just that he had an idea of what a poet who might be profiled in a newspaper should be, and I didn't meet that in all sorts of ways. And so I think you could see in the article that he wrote that he was just utterly perplexed by the fact that he wanted me to be this sort of indigent, sort of poor, ready to be patronised ethnic minority poet, but who also had a PhD, and he didn't know what to do with that. You know, for him, those two things didn't go together. And
no, and it was obvious to everybody. And I think I mean, I was, as a publisher, I wasn't allowed to wade in and comment on any of this, what was happening to your author, who you wanted fiercely to defend at all costs, and you wanted to sort of kick people between the legs. But it was very interesting for me to watch it, because I'm going to quote some of Sarah Howe. Someone I now forget once said, "Journeying is hard." And I think what you learnt was that with any change, to affect any change is difficult. Any mobility of any sort is difficult. Social mobility, whatever. It's a painful thing to crack through. And I think what your book did in many ways, and I think you're far too self-deprecating, and I've never, in all the years that I've published books, I've never quite seen a response to your poems, not just through readers, but through people that I would send the books to, fellow writers. I'd never received such an effusive and warm response to a debut collection of poems ever, I think, and you know, that might be the case for many years to come. And I think that your work the intelligence of your work is an antidote to a lot of poetry that's being written without feeling and without sincerity. And I think that's one of the reasons why your poems really hit home and why they struck fire, that new thing, because it was in many ways a well-timed antidote to all that.
That lack of sincerity, that kind of the antidote to the lack of sincerity, I think is so true in so much of what Chatto is publishing, and in so much of what I admire in poetry. This kind of antidote to a kind of cultural prevents the lack of sincerity as well, actually.
But when I think about these two poets, when I think about Sarah's work and when I think about Andrew's work, I think there's one word that comes to mind, and that word is risk. And I was thinking about a review that I'd read of Andrew's work recently, which said that to use the word cock in a poem is a political act. And I was thinking, good for you. And that's something that, you know, maybe 5 years ago it would have been a ball that wouldn't have been caught. So that's something new.
I mean, certainly after The Guardian, I think it was Claire Armistead came, like, kind of I was talking to her, she gave an interview and said, I saw the kind of cover of the book, which is this kind of lovely chap, with pert buttocks, and kind of saw the title and kind of read the blurb and things and thought that it wouldn't be for her, because she thought it was kind of she thought it would be for a particular kind of audience, and she said, actually, which was lovely, that she felt it opened out wider than what she'd anticipated, because it is just kind of universal truths, however much you think it's going to talk to one kind of thing. I mean, in terms of like what the Guardian thing changed, it was literally, I think, on a superficial level, just that people that would never have known about the book or bought the book. So in terms of sales and things like that, it was nice, because I kind of felt like when it had been kind of shortlisted for stuff or whatever, that the poetry, which is lovely and I loved it, but the poetry world is such a kind of small world that everyone that kind of wanted to know about it kind of already knew about it in a way, and so that was kind of nice. Whereas this was kind of throwing it out to people who might not have ever come across it before. And that's what was really nice. And then people can kind of either take it or leave it and not like it. But it was kind of, it put it in front of an audience that I don't think would have ever come across it, really.
As Parisa says, it's the double edge of the media, because the media, it does get things out like a microphone, like a microphone, to lots more people than would other get it. But the guardians of it are often these people who want to who are very defended people. For instance, the arts editor of The Independent, when I was working for it, he was a man, and he said to the book's editor, "I hate poets. They never say what they mean." And, well, they do. They do say what they mean, but they mean other things as well. It was that attitude. I wonder, maybe there are some questions?
Yeah, I think it's probably time to open this up now at this point. Have we got a mic that will go around?
I love a good roving mic.
Yeah,
It's always exciting.
I know, it's fine.
You've got one just
We
here.
have people on the way.
It's always people up behind you.
You've all made a distinction between generations. An older generation that you've identified as having silver hair or perhaps no hair, and a younger generation that does have their hair. Can we dig a bit? Can we dig a bit deeper into that? What is it that you're frustrated by in terms of the older generation, and what is it that you identify with and is so important about your generation? Do you see yourself as actually being, in a sense, in two camps? You know, that the work and the interests of an older generation are no longer relevant to where you're at and what you want to do and what you want to discuss and what you want to express.
Can I take that?
I'll just throw it to you in a second. Sorry, I was going to before we threw it open, I was going to ask actually, because both Andrew and Sarah in their books, which I was going to comment on, so it just feeds into this. Sorry to jump on it. Both of them have been not only kind of, I think, subtly influenced by older poets, and interestingly so, but they've both written poems which are directly influenced. Andrew's got a poem kind of which speaks to Tom Gunn, and he's also got one that uses the lines of Tom Gunn, and Sarah's got one about Theodore Retke, among other things. So it was actually something I was going to ask as well, about this kind of generational influence rather than inhibition. So just to sort of flag up that they both have sort of written about older poets. So sorry. To pass it to.
But in terms of audience, because I'm from an older generation, I mean, I belong to the generation that started publishing in the 90s. And it was very frustrating because you would be saying things, you were all sorts of things. And most of the audience was, 3/4 of the audience was silver-haired. But now my own audience is no longer only silver-haired. So it's not only that that the younger generation of readers and listeners, as well as of poets, are attending more to poetry as something which speaks to their lives, I think. I don't know what...
I'm a younger poet with no hair, but it felt to me like that I'd read Tom Gunn particularly, I was kind of obsessed with, to an unhealthy degree, but that I wanted to read as widely as possible in these older generations who I adored. And so it wasn't that I saw myself in a different camp. There was something about, I think, our generation that somehow, whether it was through the internet and so it was more widely accessible, or whether it was a kind of economic thing, that we just kind of were able to read much somehow kind of across these different camps. And so kind of I'd read Tom Gunn, but I also read Jeff Hattersley, a great South Yorkshire poet. I also read this great 1960s Penguin anthology called Children of Albion, which is kind of underground British beat poetry. And then was reading people like Mark Doty, like Sharon Olds, which is why I kind of wanted to go to Cape. And it seemed to me that kind of all those different strands of different generations came together into something that I was starting to think could be my voice. But kind of I look at the older generations of poets, or the generations of poets that have been writing longer, because it's not necessarily an age thing, just the ones that have been publishing or writing longer. And I just hope that one day I can be as generous as I found the people have been generous to me, for no reason, when I can't give them anything. I think the generosity of generations in poetry, by a lot of people in poetry, I've been kind of knocked out by.
I think this doesn't necessarily conflict with what Parisa was saying about real voices earlier, but I've always had a troubled relationship with that dictum about finding your voice, because I guess I've always been really aware of the extent to which our voices are a tissue of voices from the past. And I think that is something that is very apparent in my book. That I guess I read my elegy for Schulige, that my imagination does seem to work in that way, that so many of those poems are dialogues, letters back into the past, and some of them are about the weight of that past as well. There's a poem which writes back to Shakespeare that has a fly that's been crushed in my collected works. And I think in some sense I am that fly, you know. That's my day job. I teach Shakespeare. But I also feel the weight of that canon, which until very recently hasn't included people who look like me. But on the question of influence and indebtedness to an earlier generation, I still feel sometimes like I'm having to play catch-up with reading the generations of poets in the UK above me, because I started writing in the US. It was when I spent a year as a graduate student in America that I first began writing poems. To that point, I don't think I'd read any American poetry, because you weren't allowed to in my English degree. You had to, the American paper was a third-year option, which I didn't take. But I arrived in the States and I took this class reading contemporary American poetry, and I was just absolutely blown away. I was like, oh my God, I found it. This is how you do it. And that was a real revelation to me. And I suppose I feel in many ways like that is the tradition that I'm most comfortable with still. So I guess that means that I have a slightly slant relationship with predecessors in the UK. But
perhaps it's a useful thing to say that, I mean, we're talking about an art which is very uneconomical. You know, you can spend, Elizabeth Bishop, also a Chatto poet, spent 10 years writing The Moose, you know, and it's 3 pages in a book. And you can spend a year writing a poem. And what you get for it, you might get £75 if you get in the LRB, you know. So that's not a very sort of economic, and it's the same thing with bookshops, that most books of poetry have a very short shelf life, and they send them back, don't they, Parisa, or something? You send them all when they come out.
They're returns. But in saying that, I have some research which is hot off the press, which I wanted to share with you all tonight, actually, because about this business of poetry not being a kind of viable, economical genre, which is bullshit. Because I can reveal exclusively today that annual sales of poetry books are set to surpass £10 million for the first time since records began. The bookseller can reveal on National Poetry Day, 6th of October. The poetry market last year enjoyed its highest sales ever, both in volume and in value, selling over 1 million books at an all-time high of 8.8 million in value. And that's 15% up from the year before. And that is, from a publisher's point of view, a remarkable shift. Like a remarkable, what's it called? Like a sand, water, what's that metaphor? Poets. Sea change, exactly. So it's always useful to have a panel of poets by your side. So in a way, and I think I'm starting to think, why is that? And I honestly, in kind of in relation to your question, I think it's because there is a new generation coming up. Mark my words, they have not usurped the sort of previous generation. They're still sort of standing bemused on the sidelines, kind of scratching their heads and wondering what's going on. But they're nevertheless still in what I would say pole position. But then these kind of poets are attracting wider readers, and I think it's readers that might be accessing them on BBC 6 Music or BBC 2 on television, and that's what I think is attributing to this, because certainly when I started, there were a core market for poetry readers. You'd publish a poetry book and you'd sell about 1,500 copies, and you'd sort of know who you were selling it to because they were the same 1,500 copies, people buying the same copies. And the wonderful thing about publishing these new poets is that that figure's just been cocked into a hat. So it's interesting. So it's in terms of a genre, yes, you don't make a lot of money writing it, and you do, per word, it's sort of frightening how much you earn. And poetry is, an art of distillation and concision. But it is a lot more people are buying it, and a lot more people are reading it, and I think that's the kind of headline.
I think it's that a lot more people feel that it's okay to give it a go. They feel more as if they've got a passport to it when they didn't have it before. Somebody has let them in. When I started trying to do this column, everybody said, well, poetry is too difficult. That was the word. This was a terrible word, difficult. And now they don't care. I mean, after all, using a mobile phone is much more difficult than reading a poem.
Parisa, compared with Kate or Pickle, this issue in both meanings of the word, small and jewel-like. Is the size of the list determined by corporate policy or constrained by the time commitments of your own working method as a very hands-on editor?
It fluctuates all the time. I mean, I'm not just the poetry editor. I edit fiction, and I edit non-fiction, and I edit one cookery writer on our list who's Nigella Lawson, who's a complete anomaly on our list, but she started her career as a literary writer, and she, for some reason or other, is published at Chatto. But my point is, if I were just the poetry editor, I probably wouldn't have a job, because I publish about 4 poetry books a year out of about 10 books, 10 books in total. And the books that I publish depend entirely on where the poet is at any given time. I try to publish one debut collection a year, because I think that for my list to have any sense of momentum and identity, it needs to have one new strong voice straight out of the box every year. And I'm not idiotic to think that I publish 2 a year, because then they will compete against one another in terms of prizes and slots and stuff like that. But there's some years, like this year, for instance, I didn't publish any debuts because there simply weren't any debuts that I wanted to publish this year. And I didn't want to fall into the habit of, or into the sort of pit of actually just trying to publish because that's expected of me. I'm publishing one next year, and hopefully in the years to come. But I have never had a strategy about it, apart from the sense of that new voices are really important, and that as much as possible I should publish one a year. But poets deliver as and when, and they're published. Some years I do 2 books, some years I do 4 books, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just has to be the primary thing of the books, and they govern in many ways how many we publish and what we do. There's no strategy there.
I think we've probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions, if there's any.
Up at the back there.
Up back and
Thanks. I just want to kind of come back to the introductory remarks to this I found really interesting, is in a way of kind of opening up something which, another kind of aspect in modern poetry I don't think really has been talked about here, because it's obviously not where any of you work in the kind of genres. But Sarah, you said the poem you read of yours, you said had been seen by most eyes because it had been performed by Stephen Hawking and recorded and broadcast on YouTube. And then the second one, you said that we might know it because it went viral in 2014 in a very similar way. And then Parisa as well, you said that the energy you witnessed at the T.S. Eliot Prize in the audience. And when I spoke to this, I think contemporary poem, 2 movements that massively took off, which have driven actually a massive rise in performance poetry, which have driven that audience side of things, and are both the 2 genres which have taken most keen advantage of new media, are slam poetry and then hip-hop, rise of hip-hop in the US, and then over here and across the entire world. And so, given they've kind of almost revived performance poetry and very much democratized it, and so I'm just wondering, given this panel has been centered around kind of printed publishing, I'm just wondering what you all feel about the effect of this new media, And how does it link to the kind of rise in performance poetry at the same time? And do you guys give consideration to trying to get your poems more out there in performances nowadays as well?
But one difference between performance poetry, slam poetry, and poetry for the page is that the effect of it depends on the presence of the poet. And, you know, there are some wonderful performances out there. And so it's very, very much a relationship between the words as they're spoken and the people they're spoken to. And poetry for the page is, you know, as Sarah was saying, well, as you know, you want something that is going to be read silently again and again. And sometimes when there used to be poems on the Underground, and that was a perfect place. You would see one person taking in 6 lines of poem and really thinking about them. And so I think that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think performance poetry, I've got a massive admiration for it. It's not something I can do. I don't claim to be a performer. I think I can read my work all right, and I can kind of engage someone, but I'm not a performer. I think what it's done is twofold. I think it's allowed a lot of people an access way into a wider kind of world of poetry that they might not have been aware of. So if your kind of access point is kind of someone like the brilliant Luke Wright or Kate Tempest or whoever it is, that you then go, oh, but their reference, you know, Kate Tempest referencing all the classics, I better go and kind of look at what she's saying about that. So it becomes a kind of gateway thing for that. But also, we've all kind of been able to take advantage, I think, of the kind of growth of festivals and things over the last few years, and kind of I've kind of gone to places like Latitude or places like Wilderness Festival, which kind of aren't really, and Liz Berry I think did Wilderness the year before I did, and it's kind of incongruous place sometimes for a page poet to be, but that's been really interesting, and the audiences are always really appreciative. But certainly I think it's the rise in performance poetry and its acceptance much more into the mainstream has grown forced more people somehow into thinking that they can, we could put poets on and people might come and see them. And so the rise of kind of literature festivals, which again is also economical because you kind of they see it as a money thing, but that I think there's more space for us to share and read our work than maybe there would have been if we'd have been published 10 years ago. But I don't know if that's true because I'm new to this kind of world.
I guess I'd like to answer both strands of that, in as much as, I suppose, like Ruth and Andrew, I feel like my poems are still maybe primarily for the page, but that's not to say that I don't think about performance. In fact, I find that a very important aspect of my work, and I think that page-stage boundary does tend to break down slightly differently for poets of colour, and so maybe it's not very obvious to people, but some of the poets I most admire and feel like I've been really influenced by have been ones that began in the spoken word tradition, like for example, Kai Miller is a poet who has been tremendously important and influential on my work, and I just can't hear him read enough. And there was a period just after I got back from the States in July, August this year, where there were maybe 6 weeks where I was doing a reading practically every day, which was quite tiring. But I also got this sense of how amazing it can be to connect with an audience in a room, and actually that is something that I really value, and I find that that might be the way that my book will live best, actually. These poems that I thought were primarily for the page, actually, maybe their finest incarnation is in the voice in those rooms where my body is doing something that the page can't do. But I'm also really interested in the internet and new media. When Ruth was talking about her column, I kept thinking that the magazine I founded, Prac Crit, is in many ways a continuation of that project. And it partly came out of my frustration at reviews and their constraints, like what can you say in 500 words in a newspaper. So Pratt Crit is a digital-only magazine, and I think if it does anything, it may be, my hope for it would be that because it has this split-screen format, so the poem is on the left-hand side of the page, and on the right-hand side of the page is either an interview with the poet or an essay about the poem, that maybe that as a platform could create the horizons of expectation, could, even though they're quite in-depth essays, that people might come to Pratt Crit as a gateway to find out how to read contemporary poetry, people who wouldn't know where to start. So that's my hope for that new medium.
People ask me all the time about the distinction between page poetry and performance poetry, and I think my poets, or the poets on our list, are wonderful performers of their work. If you go and hear Liz Berry read, you come and talk to me about performance poetry. But I'm all up for porous boundaries. So I'm trying not to make any distinction, actually. I have the debut I'm publishing next year is by a poet called Kayo Chingonyi, who's a British Zambian poet. And what I love about him is he sort of loves music, so he has a lot of music projects on the side, and then he collaborates with choreographers in dance projects and stuff like that. And then he seems to me to be perfectly placed to blow this what I think is false distinction completely out of the water, because you see him on the page and he's to die for, and then you see him on the stage and he will blow you away. So he I think will put to bed a lot of these notions of this distinction, and I think the more porous it is, that boundary line, the better. Why not? It's all about hearing and accessing it, as far as I'm concerned.
I think one more. We've got time for one more. I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how I want to phrase this, but one thing I've found kind of troubling in some kind of media interactions is how there's sometimes an acceptance of minority voices, but purely within the kind of viewpoint of a universal experience. So like most shockingly for me was kind of post the Orlando shootings, the kind of some media reaction that said, this is an attack on all of us, when that in many ways that blatantly wasn't true. How do you deal with what could be a conflict between a minority voice that has very particular things to say and wanting to access, universal experience and empathy with a wide audience?
This is something I think about all the time, and I feel like if my work had a theme, it would probably be that one, actually. I did laugh at one quite bad review I got on the internet. The reviewer, there were a few incriminating moments I felt. He said that men don't come off very well in this book, which made me laugh. He also said it's not her fault, she's only half Chinese, which suggests maybe the expectations and pressures on minority poets. But he also pointed, and I thought this was quite interesting as an exercise actually, to several poems of mine that use a plural first-person pronoun. So he said of one of the very early poems in my book, it has this line, something sets us looking for a place, for many minutes every day we lose ourselves to somewhere else. And he was like, I feel excluded by that we. How dare she speak for a universal human experience and magisterially include me in her we as a middle-aged white man. And I sort of like was, really? But reading that did make me suddenly much more aware about pronouns and my claim to speak for some undistinguished we. And I guess the way that I would defend that gesture is that I didn't feel like I was unself-conscious about it, even though I'd not thought about it. There's another line in one of my poems. It goes, at empathy's darkening pain we see our own reflected face. And I guess that image for me was about if a poem, if literature is a window that we look through into the experience of another person, it's very easy for when it gets dark outside, that what happens with a window pane, all you see is not the view anymore, but your own face reflected back. And I guess I'm fascinated by that mechanism and the extent to which we can get through, beyond, past it.
I mean, I struggled for long a long time with whether I was comfortable being called a gay poet, because I always kind of thought, part of me always kind of thought, well, I'm just a poet who writes love poems that happen to be to men because I've only kind of ever fallen in love with men. But certainly post Orlando, which I found incredibly politicising and kind of devastating. But also prior to that, I kind of recognised of my own privilege of being white, of being middle class, of being well off, of being everything like that, that I never really needed that label to kind of feel secure, but a lot of other people did. And I just wrote this little thing for Poetry Review, which was just me kind of looking at kind of American poets and kind of me reading them post Orlando and kind of what it really felt to me to read people like Sam Sachs or Ocean Vuong, who Jonathan Cape are going to publish next year. And so I've kind of come around, I think, to thinking that, I mean, certainly, you know, if it's, oftentimes if I'm kind of written up anywhere, it'll either say Barnsley born, Northern poet, things like that, which is fine. And I'm kind of, on one level, if that's a hook that will get someone in and then they'll read the work and they'll get something else out of it that they didn't expect, that confounding of expectations, then I don't really mind it. But it always shows up to me that no one would ever be described as the, you know, in the kind of national media as the London-based poet, or the kind of southern poet, it'd be the northern poet, or would never be described as the white poet, or the kind of straight poet. That they always, all these kind of epithets always point towards the fact that there is still a dominant kind of hegemonic identity which somehow we're seen as transgressing from, and that becomes the kind of epithet that sometimes they like to use, but hopefully they read the work and see that it is universal.
But it's quite interesting how it's moved on, because, you know, when we all started publishing in the 90s, and it was I had the only woman editor in town. That was Rebecca at Chatto. And all the other poetry editors were men. But there was one woman editor in Ireland. And most of the arts commentators were men as well. And so the word woman was just like the word gay now. You know, a woman poet always came in front of the word poet. Was this word woman? You know, I mean, it was, and that has stopped.
Poetess.
Oh, okay, that abominable word.
I think on that bombshell, these women have spoken for long enough, I think. So no, it remains only to say thank you to Andrew, to Ruth, to Sarah, and to Parisa, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.